In 1909, college football faced an existential crisis. The sport was at a crossroads with 11 reported deaths at the college level and an estimated 26 overall when including high schools and other organizations. Some of these deaths occurred in highly publicized games early in the season, with quarterback Earl Wilson of Navy being killed in a game with Villanova, while Army tackle Eugene Bryne was killed playing against Harvard. The publicity threw football into a situation where the game had to change or be abolished. The brutality of the game had become so concerning that some universities were considering banning football entirely. Common sentiment now is that in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt stepped in, and in 1906, the forward pass was legalized and the game was saved. Truth is, the rules changes of 1905 1906 made the game more deadly than ever. In response to the crisis, the Intercollegiate Athletic Association Football Rules Committee, that's a mouthful, a precursor of today's NCAA, convened with representatives from major institutions like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Chicago. Under the leadership of Chairman L.M. Dennis of Cornell and Secretary Edward K. Hall of Dartmouth, they had a clear mission: determine if football had become more dangerous than in previous seasons, and if so, why. The committee approached their task systematically. They needed to identify the sources of danger, discuss how each could be removed or reduced, and propose specific rule modifications, all while trying to preserve the fundamental nature of football. After extensive deliberation, they compiled a list of the 20 most dangerous plays in football. The list is taken from David Nelson's Anatomy of a Game, published in 1994. Nelson does an excellent job of detailing the changes in college football. This list, compiled by some of the most respected names in college football at the time, would shape the future of the sport. The sport was literally killing people. The death sent shockwaves through American universities. After all, no college president wanted to write home to a mother explaining why her son wouldn't be coming back from school, all because of a game. In response, the 1910 Rules Committee gathered to take a hard look at football. They wanted to understand, was the game becoming more dangerous? And if so, why? Looking at this list of 20 dangerous plays, we can see just how different, and in some ways, how similar, football was back then compared to today. What's fascinating is how some of these dangers remain eerily relevant more than a century later, while others seem almost unbelievable to modern fans. Let's start with what might be the most dangerous play in football, both then and now: the kickoff return. In 1910, the committee identified returning the ball on kickoffs as one of their top concerns. And you know what? They were absolutely right. Even today, kickoff returns remain one of football's most hazardous plays. The reason is simple physics. You have players running full speed in opposite directions, creating collisions with extraordinary force. While modern rules have tried to make kickoffs safer, like moving the kickoff spot and implementing touchbacks incentives, the fundamental danger remains the same. Some leagues have even considered eliminating kickoffs entirely. In 1910, they were also deeply concerned about diving tackles, though they weren't talking about what we'd call targeting today. Back then, players would literally launch themselves through the air at opponents, using their bodies like human missiles. Note this photo, which I think looks really arranged, but you get the idea of what it might have been like. Imagine defenders literally flying at ball carriers with no rules about leading with the helmet, because there weren't really any helmets as we know them today, and no restrictions on how you could hit someone. It's no wonder why this made their danger list. One of the most fascinating items on their list was recovering an onside kick by a member of either team. But here's the interesting part. Onside kick of 1909 was a completely different play than what we know about onside kicks today. Back then, any time the ball was punted and hit the ground, it became a live ball that anyone could recover. So if you imagine a play from scrimmage where a player could suddenly punt the ball forward, and as soon as it touched the ground, it became a free for all with 22 players diving and fighting for possession. Also known as the onside kick from scrimmage, it was so dangerous that by 1923 they had eliminated this version of the onside kick entirely. The other problem was is that it didn't work very well because it was unpredictable as to where the ball would bounce, and people didn't use it a lot. Even today, our modern version of the onside kick, where teams kick off with the hopes of recovering the ball, remains one of football's most dangerous plays. The combination of high-speed collisions, multiple players diving for a loose ball, and the desperation of the moment makes it a recipe for injury. It's a reminder that while the rules may change, some fundamental dangers in football persist throughout the ages. They had a particular concern about tackling the punt receiver. There's good reason for this. Picture yourself standing still, looking up at the sky, waiting for the ball, while opponents charge at you at full speed. In the early days of football, the punt receiver could make a fair catch if he made a mark with his heel at the spot where he was making the catch. This was done while catching the ball, so he could easily be blasted if the opposing player didn't recognize he was heeling the ball. This was later changed in the 1900s so a punt returner could raise his hand in the air to signal fair catch. It was easy to miss, but the requirement to wave his hand above his head didn't come until 1973, and it wasn't until 1983 that they finally established a 2-yard protective zone around punt returners. Here's one that might surprise you. Piling on a player crawling with the ball. In modern football, we're used to plays being blown dead pretty quickly, but this wasn't the case in 1909. The 1909 rulebook included the following about being called down. Down occurs when the down referee blows his whistle or declares the ball dead. The referee shall blow his whistle or declare the ball dead when a player having the ball cries down, and when any portion of his person, except his hands or feet, touches the ground while he is in the grasp of the opponent. And there's more to that. When he goes out of bounds, whenever he is held so that his forward progress is stopped, when on a forward pass, the ball, after being passed forward, touches the ground before being touched by a player of either side. Go back and note the phrase, while in the grasp of an opponent. Officials didn't blow their whistles to stop play as quickly because of that phrase. Back then, it led to bizarre situations where players would crawl along the ground trying to gain extra yards, while defenders would jump on them, often knees first, to make them cry down. In other words, I'd scream, I'm down, so people wouldn't jump on him anymore, I guess. One of the most tragic dangers they identified was concentrated and continuous attack against one player. This came directly from the death of Eugene Bryne, who played tackle for Army. In 1909, the offenses would repeatedly attack the defensive tackle position because it was seen as a weak point in the line. They would run play after play at the same defender until they wore him down. In Bryne's case, he became exhausted but wasn't taken out of the game. He died on the field after being repeatedly targeted by these mass attacks. Speaking of mass attacks, they were also concerned about throwing oneself under a play. This might sound strange until you understand that offensive plays often involved a mass of players moving together, pushing and pulling the ball carrier forward. One way to stop this human battering ram was to throw yourself under the first player, hoping to trip up the entire group. Yes, this was actually a legitimate defensive strategy. The committee also considered exhaustion as a serious danger. This might seem obvious to us today, but games back then could last up to 70 or even 90 minutes. And there weren't substitutions like there are now. Players would become completely exhausted, leading to poor decision-making and an inability to protect themselves. This recognition led to the creation of quarters in football, giving players more opportunities to rest during the game. They were also concerned about games between very unevenly matched teams. This might sound like an odd safety concern, but it was a real problem. Major college teams would often play against high school teams or small colleges, leading to massive mismatches. Imagine a team of fully grown men playing against teenagers. It was as dangerous as it sounds. Here's one that shows how brutal the game was. Using the heel of the hand on an offensive player's face. Players would strike opponents in the face with the heel of their hand because it wasn't technically a closed fist, which was illegal. It was a way to get around the rules against punching while still being able to strike an opponent in the face. Some of their concerns still resonate strongly today, like tackling an opponent harder than necessary to stop him. We now call this unnecessary roughness. But the fundamental issue remains the same: the line between making a solid football play and unnecessarily endangering an opponent. They were also worried about poorly conditioned teams and physical incapacity. While newspapers of the era often blamed players for their own deaths due to poor conditioning, there's a deeper truth here. Football is an incredibly demanding sport, and playing it without proper physical preparation puts athletes at serious risk. This remains true today, though modern training and conditioning programs have become far more sophisticated. What's remarkable about this list is how many of these dangers the committee accurately identified. Their work led to significant rule changes that made the game safer while preserving its essential character. They eliminated some of the most dangerous plays, like the flying tackle and mass plays. They created quarters to combat exhaustion, and they established more protection for vulnerable players. But perhaps most importantly, they recognized something fundamental about football's dangers, something that Harvard president Charles Eliot pointed out at the time. Eliot had stated, "Men are killed and wounded in hunting, rowing, riding, horseback on a road or in steeplechase, sailing boats, canoeing, and climbing mountains. But what distinguished football from other dangerous sports was that the dangers in football resulted from risks of the game deliberately planned and deliberately maintained. Unlike other dangerous sports where injuries typically resulted from accidents, football's dangers were deliberately planned and deliberately maintained. They were built into the very structure of the game. This realization led to a crucial understanding. If football's dangers were created by rules, they could also be reduced by rules. It's a lesson that continues to shape the evolution of football today. Every year, the NFL and NCAA continue to modify rules to make the game safer while trying to maintain its essential character, just as that 1910 committee tried to do. The story of football's most dangerous plays isn't just about a list from 1910. It's about an ongoing struggle to balance the inherent violence of a collision sport with the need to protect its players. Some of the specific dangers have changed, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do we preserve what makes football exciting while preventing it from becoming lethal? In his book, Nelson states, "Whenever a rules committee member in the next 80 years made a rules change recommendation, it was probably based on Chairman Hall's 1910 list." Looking back at the list from 1910, we can see how far football has come and how far it still has to go. Many of their concerns have been addressed through rule changes and better equipment, but others, like the dangers of kickoff returns and the issues with unnecessarily violent tackles, continue to challenge the sport today. What's clear is that football has always been a dangerous game, but it's also clear that through careful analysis and thoughtful rules changes, it's possible to make it safer without destroying what makes it special. That's the legacy of the 1910 Rules Committee, and it's a legacy that continues to influence football today. I'm John Johnston, and this is Hardcore College Football History. Thank you for your support so far, and if you like these videos, please consider subscribing. If you like them a lot, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you.